Thank you, Senator Mackenzie. Senator Ludlam.
Thanks, Mr Deputy President. Last Thursday I spent the night in a sleeping bag on 3 sheets of cardboard on the streets of Canberra with several hundred others as part of the Vinnie's CEO sleepout. This was to raise funds and awareness of what it must be like for the nearly 7,000 Australians who have to do this every night. In terms of raising funds, it was an extraordinary success, and nearly $5 million was raised by those who participated. In terms of raising awareness, of course, it did. I think it did its job very well also, but it is not enough to simply raise awareness if people then just turn the channel and move on to something else. This contribution tonight is not just going to be about numbers and statistics. Apart from the 3 that I'll mention now that I simply can't reconcile. The first is the figure of 105,000 Australians experiencing homelessness now, and that number went up between the census of 2006 and 2011. The second is the number of households on the social housing waiting list, 240,000 families, nearly 250,000. Families and individuals waiting and waiting. In my home state of WA, the average wait on the priority list is 63 weeks, well over a year, and it's anywhere from 2 to 7 years on the regular list. And the third number that I want us to keep in mind is the number that is the gap of affordable and available private rental homes on the private rental market, and that number is more than 500,000. Anybody can tell you that these figures have got worse over the years. I've raised each of these numbers year after year in this place, in estimates committees and elsewhere. Unless, of course, you are an investor or you already are well and truly into your own home, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Tonight, though, my point is this. We've been in a housing crisis for a decade. I've urged the government and the opposition to acknowledge the gaps and to take action and to return a sense of urgency that we had in 2008. And I've done this many, many times, and I'm sick of it. So tonight, instead of statistics, I rise to tell you of stories, stories that I imagine all of us on some level have already been touched by. The stories about homelessness and a housing crisis that has stretched across the entire spectrum across many years. Homelessness affects 1 in 200 of us as Australians. It has touched me and members of my staff personally. By briefly sleeping rough last Thursday night and then having the opportunity to launch the Greens Homelessness Initiative, which proposes to double existing services to people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, and at the same time to provide a roof over the head of every current rough sleeper, I have since been contacted by people who have directly experienced this tragic condition. People like Simon in Adelaide, who has been homeless himself but wanted to share his short story about a young man who was homeless in his village and died from exposure as a result. And Simon told us none of us knew him or that he was there, but to this day, 20 years later, his story still draws a sense of guilt and responsibility from the community. We failed to help one among us, and we are the lesser for it. People like Luke, who wrote to us from Perth. He was 19 when he became homeless, turned out of his mum's home quite suddenly. For 6 months he went to places to find help, and everywhere was full. And this is what he told us. You get to that point where you become ashamed to ask for help. You know that you're on your own and that you have to find a way to survive your situation. Then you have the problem of being clean and fresh and reliable to get a job. I never slept at night when I was homeless. I used to ride the train in the day in the warmth, and then at midnight go sit in Macca's and drink free coffee refills, and then find a nice sunny protected spot and sleep during the day. I didn't even have a blanket when I was homeless. For months I squatted in an empty house, hiding in the walk-in robe using carpet remnants to keep warm. Luke saved his money somehow on a Centrelink payment over those 6 months to buy a cheap car, a phone, some clothes from the op shop, and then he got a job delivering pizzas. He lived in his car for another 6 months after that. And these are just a small sample of the stories behind the numbers. They are, of course, about those at the very pointy end, and those sudden circumstances can happen to any of us that lead us to suddenly being without a place to stay. Paul in Sydney wrote to us. Paul has been the full-time carer for his disabled father. They were living together in social housing in New South Wales and they got a bit behind with the rent. Suddenly a letter turns up saying that the lease has been terminated. Even though he then paid half the arrears and was about to pay the rest, he was told, "You might as well save your money because we've taken your house, whether you pay the full amount or not." And the end result, Paul tells us, is I'm couch surfing and my dad's staying in a mate's granny flat without a carer. Of course, the Greens realise that it's not just about the bricks and mortar, because less than half of the people, a little bit less than half of those in Australia who use homeless services are actually homeless themselves. 56% use these services because of how close they are and how at risk they are of becoming homeless. And so it is also about the people providing these vital services, the amazing homelessness and welfare sector. In particular, groups like Anglicare, Homelessness Australia, the Community Housing Federation, and of course St Vinny's, who hosted us last week, and many hundreds of others across the country. This story is also about the structural and systemic problem with our housing market. The homelessness problem has got worse, not just because of a lack of services, but because of the same credit bubble and housing price bubble that is so beloved of the banks and the real estate pages of the newspapers. It is to be expected as rents soar in reaction to higher house prices, that in turn squeeze lower-income families out into the street. And the same story that you will see being celebrated in the newspapers as a buoyant housing market is also directly contributing to people forced out into the streets. State and federal governments are certainly good at generating subsidies for housing demand and have fallen dramatically behind on the supply side. We're not building enough affordable dwellings to cope, and we are not funding crisis services to the scale that is demanded. Crisis services, obviously, are not the answer to the fundamental problems of runaway housing prices, and governments could easily step in here across a wide range of fronts. There is government-owned land throughout our metropolitan areas that could be used, and instead they prefer to sell off their land holdings to the highest bidder. It's not also just bricks and mortar, but the services that keep people from becoming homeless that are so vital. The figures for being at risk are even more startling. 1 in 97 of us turned to services last year seeking assistance just to keep us from falling through the gaps, to keep your tenancy, to access help with mental health, financial counselling, parenting skills, relation counselling and so on, drug and alcohol services, the list goes on. And it's with great shame that I acknowledge two further things. The first is that Aboriginal homelessness rose by 3% between censuses, and making up 2.5% of the population of Australians, Aboriginal people represent a quarter of those homeless. I commend this government for its 10-year partnership on remote Indigenous housing and also the hard work of my colleague Senator Rachel Siewert. We have a long way to go, but the Greens will work harder with those in government and opposition when they can find the time to be interested in these matters to right this wrong. And the second thing that absolutely stunned me was that domestic violence is the greatest single cause of homelessness in Australia. And I don't know why that surprised me. It probably says something about me and my background that was such an extraordinarily stark statistic, that people are fleeing situations of domestic violence, mostly young women with children, and suddenly find themselves the largest cohort of homeless people in this country. These are two of this nation's great shames, and we must do more. One of the overarching goals identified by Senator Milne when she was first elected unanimously by our party room as leader was the need for a couple of things. One was a new economy to support new emerging industries and innovation, and another was a new guard of voices who have been drowned out by the old guard. So for housing, this means, in terms of a new economy, it means a couple of things. Since the White Paper was released in 2008, Ms Gina Rinehart's wealth has increased from $4.3 to $22 billion. Since the Homelessness White Paper was released, the big banks have made around $20 billion a year, and that's about $400 billion in profits. And each year since the White Paper was signed, mining profits have been in the order of $51 billion vacuumed out of the economy. Australia has experienced an unprecedented boom and has recognised as one of the top-performing economies in the world. And yet those disadvantaged before the boom still remain disadvantaged. And it is ironic and no coincidence that the resource-rich states, including WA and Queensland, there has actually been an increase both in homelessness and in people being turned away from services. In WA, the social housing waiting list in a tortured and stressed housing market has doubled since 2007. So, to refer to what Senator Milne meant in her first contributions as leader of our party room, why, for example, are we not talking about creating a housing industry that can build houses to sell for between $70,000 and $250,000, to create a green housing industry at scale that showcases Australian exemplary design and the newest, lightest, locally manufactured materials for new construction, by employing an army of retrofitters, supporting associated industries to make our existing housing stock more affordable by being cheaper to live in, reducing building costs by simply changing some of the materials that we use to build our houses. And as we announced last Friday, I'm talking in part about design, production and manufacture based on prefabricated, modular, lighter, sustainable materials, sustainably harvested timber, assembly lines in our great cities and regions. It also means changing the planning systems to fast-track exemplary sustainable developments. This is the so-called green dooring or as-of-right development, which means guaranteeing minimum approval times as long as extremely high predetermined standards are met. And it can also turn on its head the way communities are consulted and engaged on developments by engaging up front, not after the key decisions have already been made, as was done in South Australia through the Integrated Design Commission, rather than bringing communities in at the end. The tensions between the new and old voices come really in three groups: the lucky versus the locked-out generation. And the lucky are simply those who were born at the right time or into the right family, who either own their house outright or who are well on their way to doing so. The locked out include the lifetime renters and a whole generation of young people locked out of home ownership and locked into a dysfunctional rental market that is unaffordable and insecure. I guess it's possible to overemphasise the generation gap. I think we have priced an entire generation out of affordable housing. But it's also essential that we acknowledge that there are major cohorts of older people, particularly older women, those perhaps with very limited superannuation resources to fall back on, who simply will have nowhere to live. And it is also the people who are locked out of the pathway, out of the social housing system. And the Greens believe in an economy that serves people and the environment, not the other way around. The second contrast between the new voices and the old are the asset-rich versus the asset-poor. Australia's asset-rich class enjoy the world's most generous subsidies to assist them to collect houses as investment properties. These are then, of course, treated effectively, as Professor Julian Disney has pointed out, as tax shelters rather than real shelters. In Australia, asset inequality is between 50 to 400 times worse than income inequality, depending, of course, on how it's calculated. The most wealthy are quite literally getting richer off the backs of the least wealthy, the renters, and the taxpayer who provide the subsidies. Treasury estimated that the capital gains tax discount on investment properties will be worth $5.2 billion in 2013-14, and these concessions are being paid for by low and middle income taxpayers. The third set of voices that I wanted to draw attention to in terms of the contrast are those in the developer community themselves. Those are developers who think that real estate markets should simply be about sprawl, and for whom the definition of affordable is a 3x2 brick and tile cube 60 kilometres from the central business district, where if you can get into a property like that by the standard definition of affordable, you are then on your own, subject to extraordinary transport cost and basically stranded on the edges of our great cities. And those voices are now actually quite distinct from those in the developer community, the innovators, those who are interested and pioneering work in Australia on transit-centred, diverse, affordable housing of all different kinds to suit different family types and people in different circumstances. I want to take in part this opportunity to thank the army of new economists, people like Judy Yates, Julie Lawson, Ian Winter, Karen Kakis, and people everywhere who are working and thinking about how to make the housing economy fairer, and also to create an asset class for people who want to invest in affordable housing, not through some kind of shelter or some kind of rort, but people who are looking for a stable income and matching that up for people who are looking for a stable tenancy so that we're not continually being flipped from one insecure rental tenancy to another. I also want to acknowledge the community housing and not-for-profit housing sector, which I think has an enormously important future in this country. People like Carol Crochet and Eddie Burke and Anthony Rizzacasa. This is a movement which is growing and should have our every and strong support. We're all touched in this place and in this country by homelessness, directly or indirectly. And that is why it was startling to see, earlier in this session, the Coalition essentially turning its back on the homeless by refusing to even commit to the ambition, the aim, of halving homelessness by 2020. This is an aim that was adopted by the Australian Labor Party a number of years ago. That commitment was reaffirmed when we took the vote earlier in the session yesterday. And my motion earlier in the session called upon the Senate to confirm and commit to two things. Firstly, to commit to the white paper goal of halving homelessness by 2020, and then committing to a new agreement by 2020 and beyond to provide the funding and services necessary to help Australians most in need. When Mr Abbott was asked in 2010 what he thought and whether he would commit the Coalition to that goal, that ambition, acknowledging its extraordinary difficulty and that it will take time and resources and energy to do, he said something remarkable. He said, but we can't just stop people from becoming homeless if that's their choice. If that's their choice. Or if their situation is such that it's just impossible to look after them under certain circumstances, so I would rephrase a commitment like that. What a spectacular bit of rephrasing that was right there. So we don't have cross-party commitment in this parliament, and it was confirmed today because that quite clearly seems to be the attitude of the leader of the opposition. You just have to cop it, and that maybe if you're homeless, you've chosen it. What a remarkably backward attitude. In all of the cases, home, or at the very least shelter, is a basic human need. An affordable home and a roof over your head is a human right. It's not just another asset class. And the consequence of its absence for people wanting to form community bonds, get a job, get back on their feet, get their lives together are extraordinarily severe. The housing crisis can actually be tackled, and homelessness can be ended, and not halved and not reduced at a certain rate, but actually eliminated from Australian census counts. It is possible, and the initiatives that we launched on Friday last week show, independently costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office, what it would take. I think it is possible, and we are looking for the kind of cross-party support that we saw with MPs from all parties and independents sleeping rough, just for one night, with 3 sheets of cardboard and a sleeping bag, in various degrees of weather. It was below zero here in Canberra. I understand it was a little bit more balmy in Darwin and other parts of the country, but nonetheless, the ambition to be able to say this can be done, work out what it will cost, and then commit ourselves to it. Because no matter the privilege of those who get to be here, homelessness can touch all of us, and it can actually strike people at any time, where one bad circumstance, one bad relationship breakup, one loss of a job or insecure employment situation, away from being suddenly not altogether certain where we're going to be staying this time next week. This can touch all of us. We all know people. And as we've been noting in Perth, in the boomtown, where we're at the top of the commodities cycle, where money like we've never seen before is washing through that city, there are also record numbers of people sleeping in doorways, pushing possessions around in shopping trolleys, laying out a cardboard mat or a blanket or a hat in front of them, and simply gazing into the crowd of feet passing them by, and the people who occasionally would just drop a few coins into the hat, wondering how on earth they got there. Something is deeply wrong with the way that we have organised our economy if that is occurring right in the middle of the greatest commodity boom that this country has ever seen. So I do want to acknowledge the government for the ambition that was set out by former Prime Minister Rudd, establishing a housing minister for the first time, drawing most of the portfolio into one place for the first time, and also the bureaucrats who we have a contest with a couple of times a year at budget estimates, who, like the service providers, who really just want to do a job and should actually be resourced to do the job that they all want to do. There is a road home, and I look forward to a cross-party commitment to us all finally taking that road.